All right, let's dive in. Today we're looking at some major moves right out of the gate from the new administration. Executive orders, nominations, even some pardons. All from January 21st and 22nd, 2025. Those first 48 hours, they always tell a story.
It's true. You can really see those priorities taking shape, right? Not just specific policies, but signaling to Congress, to foreign leaders, everyone, what this administration is about.
Yeah, it's like setting the tone right off the bat. And speaking of priorities, let's talk about this executive order ending illegal discrimination and restoring merit-based opportunity. This one's gotten some attention, to say the least.
Definitely a bold statement right out of the gate. The argument here is that diversity, equity, and inclusion, DEI initiatives have actually become discriminatory.
Oh, okay. So like a course correction. I'm curious,
Yeah.
how do they make that case? What's the logic there?
The order claims that instead of leveling the playing field, these DEI programs have actually tipped the scales in the other direction.
Mm.
It's saying that certain groups are now prioritized based on race, color, sex, national origin, essentially creating a new form of discrimination. Reverse discrimination is what they're calling it.
So how are they tackling this? What are some of the specific actions outlined in the order?
Well, they're going for a pretty significant overhaul of how the federal government approaches diversity and inclusion. For one, they're revoking several existing executive orders related to diversity.
So wiping the slate clean, are there any examples of those revoked orders that really illustrate this shift?
Yeah, a big one is Executive Order 11246, the one that required affirmative action from government contractors. And they're also restructuring the Office of Federal Contract Compliance programs. That office will no longer be promoting diversity or holding contractors responsible for affirmative action.
Okay, so a pretty significant shift in how federal contracts are awarded. What about other parts of the government? Does this reach beyond just contracts?
Oh, it goes further. The Attorney General is now tasked with putting together a report on how to better enforce civil rights laws. And get this, encouraging the private sector to end what they call DEI discrimination. There's even guidance for educational institutions to comply with the Students for Fair Admissions Supreme Court case, the one about college admissions.
So the ripple effects go way beyond just federal agencies, businesses, universities, they're all in the mix now.
Exactly. And they specifically call out some industries where they see this as a big problem, like finance, tech, healthcare. They even call some of them the most egregious and discriminatory DEI practitioners.
Okay, so now I got to ask, how are they going to enforce all this? What's the mechanism for putting pressure on these private companies?
Well, they're talking about potential civil compliance investigations, looking into major corporations, nonprofits, even universities. Doesn't get into specifics about penalties or anything, but it definitely raises the stakes.
Wow, a lot to unpack there. What are your initial reactions to this? Is this a legitimate attempt to ensure everyone has a fair shot? Or is it a step back in terms of addressing systemic inequalities?
It's important to remember this is a really complex issue with strong opinions on all sides. We're just laying out the information from the executive order, letting you form your own informed opinion.
Absolutely. All right, let's switch gears a bit. This administration's focus on safety and, as they call it, merit-based practices extends beyond just hiring practices. Let's talk about aviation. There's a presidential action here titled Keeping Americans Safe in Aviation, and it's raising some questions.
This one directly links the FAA's previous focus on diversity with potential compromises to safety. They're suggesting that recruiting people with certain disabilities, while well-intentioned, might impact their ability to do some of these critical jobs.
Hold on, so they're saying efforts to diversify the SAA workforce might have actually made flying less safe. That's a pretty big claim.
It is, and they're backing it up by calling for a return to strictly merit-based hiring at the FAA. Emphasis on capability and competence above all else.
Okay, but how do you even define merit objectively? It seems like that could easily become a way to exclude certain groups.
That's the real question, right? The order doesn't get into those specifics, how they plan to evaluate merit fairly.
And it's not just about hiring new people either, right? There's also talk about reviewing current personnel.
Right, they're calling for a complete review of everyone in critical safety positions. Anyone who doesn't meet these new standards, no matter their background, how long they've been there, could be replaced.
So potential shakeups within the FAA, that's bound to be controversial.
No doubt about it. This action could have huge ripple effects within the FAA. It'll be interesting to see how they handle implementation and what the long-term impact is on both safety and the makeup of the workforce.
This brings up the question of how to balance these competing values, right? Diversity, safety, excellence,
Mhm.
especially in something as important as aviation. What are your thoughts on this? Striking the right balance? Or going too far?
It's complicated, right? No easy answers. This really highlights the need for open discussions about the potential consequences of policy decisions like these.
For sure. All right, let's shift our focus to the international arena, specifically the Middle East. There's a presidential action here titled Designation of Ansar Allah as a Foreign Terrorist Organization. But before we jump in, can you give us some context? Who are Ansar Allah and what's their role in the Yemen conflict?
Sure. Ansar Allah, they're also known as the Houthis, are a rebel group that's been fighting the Yemeni government for control of the country for years now. They're a major force in the conflict, controlling a lot of territory, including the capital, Sana'a.
Right, and this conflict has created a massive humanitarian crisis, terrible famine, people displaced from their homes. This presidential action is taking a very strong stance against them.
Absolutely. The document paints a pretty stark picture, accusing them of all kinds of aggression. Attacks on U.S. Navy warships, hitting civilian infrastructure in Saudi Arabia and the UAE, disrupting commercial shipping in the Red Sea. It's a long list.
And there's also the issue of their ties to Iran, right?
Yeah, they're alleging close ties between the Houthis and Iran's Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps Quds Force, the IRGC-QF. And the U.S. has already labeled the IRGC-QF as a terrorist organization.
So this basically puts the Houthis in the same category as groups like ISIS and al-Qaeda. That's a huge escalation, gives the U.S. a lot more power to act against them.
Exactly. This opens up a whole range of options: sanctions, freezing assets, even potential military action. The order also calls for more cooperation with regional partners to counter their activities, cut off their resources.
So big consequences here. What are your thoughts on this move? Could this help bring stability to Yemen, or is this likely to make things worse?
It's really hard to say at this point what the ultimate impact will be. The situation in Yemen is incredibly complicated. Escalating things further always carries the risk of unintended consequences.
A lot to keep an eye on. You know what? I think this is a good place to pause for today. We've covered a lot of ground. We'll pick back up with the nominations and pardons in part 2.
Sounds good. There's a lot to unpack there, too. We'll dive into those in the next deep dive. All right, picking up where we left off, we were about to dig into those pardons and nominations, right?
Yeah, I'm really curious about these. Pardons, those are a pretty big deal, you know? It's a direct use of presidential power, and I think it says a lot about this administration's thinking, especially on issues like justice and second chances.
Yeah, I agree. Pardons are definitely worth examining.
So we've got these two pardons for Andrew Zabavsky and Terrence Sutton. Now, I know you might be wondering about the details of their convictions, and honestly, so am I. But the documents don't actually give us a whole lot to go on. What we do know is that these pardons basically wipe the slate clean for these guys. Civil rights restored, the whole 9 yards.
Right, and that's what makes pardons so powerful. It's not just a symbolic gesture. It has real consequences.
Yeah.
It really allows someone to move forward without that criminal record hanging over them.
Exactly. Gives them a chance to rebuild their lives. And the fact that the president chose to use this power so early in his term, well, it suggests that criminal justice reform is pretty high on the agenda.
It does raise questions about their approach to crime and punishment, right?
Mm.
Do they believe in second chances? Are they more focused on rehabilitation? Something to think about as we look at the bigger picture of their actions.
For sure. Okay, let's circle back to those nominations we talked about earlier. I think they offer some interesting clues about what this administration wants to accomplish.
Yeah, personnel choices can be really telling. It shows where a president wants to put their focus. And some of these are pretty interesting.
All right, give me a highlight. Who stands out to you?
Well, there's Michael Kratsios, nominated for Director of the Office of Science and Technology Policy. He's got a strong background in tech innovation, played a key role in promoting artificial intelligence during the last administration.
Interesting. So could his nomination signal a renewed push for U.S. leadership in the tech sector? Maybe we'll see more investment in AI research and development.
It's certainly possible.
Oh.
And there's another one that hints at a focus on security, Stephen Bradbury. He's nominated for Deputy Secretary of Transportation, and he's got a ton of experience in national security and transportation security issues.
So maybe this means we'll see heightened security at airports, other transportation hubs, maybe even a response to those recent cybersecurity concerns. It's all speculation for now, but it's interesting to connect the dots and see where things might be headed.
It's like putting together a puzzle.
Right.
Each piece gives you a little more information.
All right, so let's go back to that executive order on discrimination for a minute. We keep coming back to this one because it's got such wide-reaching implications. And there's one piece we haven't really dug into yet, the impact on the private sector.
Right. This isn't just about changing things within the government. It's sending a message to businesses and organizations all over the country.
Yeah, it's almost like a preemptive strike.
Yeah.
They're not waiting for lawsuits or anything. They're going after what they consider violations of civil rights laws.
Exactly. They're giving the Attorney General a lot of leeway to encourage private companies to end what they're calling illegal discrimination and preferences.
That's strong language. Sounds like they're setting the stage for a more adversarial relationship with companies that don't fall in line.
It's definitely possible. And remember, they specifically mentioned targeting the most egregious and discriminatory DEI practitioners, even talking about potential civil compliance investigations of major corporations, nonprofits, even universities.
So they're not messing around. This could have a huge impact on hiring practices, promotions, even how diversity and inclusion are talked about in the workplace.
It's almost like they're trying to redefine what diversity and inclusion even mean in the context of work.
And this is where it gets really interesting for everyone listening, right? It goes way beyond just government policy. Think about the companies you interact with, the products you buy, the places you work or go to school. This order could potentially affect all of those areas.
Definitely raises some big questions. Do you think this is necessary to make sure everyone has a fair chance, regardless of their background? Or do you worry that it could backfire and actually harm efforts to promote diversity and inclusion?
It's a tough one. Valid points on both sides. That's why it's so important to stay informed, have these conversations, think critically about these issues.
Now, sticking with this executive order for another minute, let's talk about some of the internal changes within the government. This isn't just talk. They're actually making concrete changes.
Okay, so what are some of the key things happening within federal agencies?
Well, one of the biggest is the call for the Director of the Office of Management and Budget, the OMB, to basically review and revise all government-wide procedures, directives, guidance, all of it, related to diversity, equity, and inclusion.
So going through everything with a fine-tooth comb, making sure it aligns with this new philosophy.
Exactly. They want to get rid of any language, any policies that promote what they see as these discriminatory concepts.
Yeah.
It's a huge task, and I'm really curious to see how different agencies interpret and actually put these changes into practice.
And it's not just the OMB either, right? They're also tasking the Attorney General with working with agency heads to identify potential civil compliance investigations. Sounds like a coordinated effort to really make sure everyone's on board with this new vision.
Oh yeah, it's definitely a top-down approach. No question this is a priority for them.
It seems like they're really trying to change the way we think about these issues, moving away from what they consider an overemphasis on identity and towards a more merit-based system.
It's bold for sure. It'll be
Yeah.
interesting to see how it all plays out.
And that's exactly why we wanted to dig into all of this with you. These actions are complex, they're controversial, and they have the potential to affect all of us in big ways.
It's not just about what they say, it's about understanding why they're doing it and what the potential fallout might be.
Okay, before we wrap up this part, let's bring it back to that foreign policy issue. We still need to unpack that designation of Ansar Allah as a foreign terrorist organization.
Yeah, that one deserves its own deep dive. Big ramifications for the U.S. and the Middle East, the potential for peace in Yemen. It's a lot to consider.
All right, we'll tackle all of that in part 3. Stay tuned.
Welcome back, everyone, to the final part of our deep dive. It's been quite a journey, hasn't it? From changing priorities on diversity and inclusion to possible changes at the FAA, and now we're back to foreign policy. That designation of Ansar Allah, the Houthis, as a foreign terrorist organization. This one's a big deal, with potential impacts on U.S. involvement in the Middle East and that already volatile situation in Yemen. Yeah, no question about it. This action really shows how this administration plans to approach foreign policy, particularly dealing with groups they see as a threat to U.S. interests. And they're definitely not shying away from taking a strong stance.
And the Houthis are definitely on their radar, that's for sure. Let's remind everyone what makes them such a concern.
Well, the document goes into a lot of detail about the Houthis, accusing them of a whole bunch of aggressive actions. Attacks on U.S. Navy warships, strikes against civilian targets in Saudi Arabia and the UAE, even disrupting commercial shipping in the Red Sea. It's a pretty long list.
And they're not just calling out the Houthis themselves, they're highlighting those alleged ties to Iran, right?
Right. They're explicitly making that connection between the Houthis and Iran's Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps, Quds Force,
Yeah.
the IRGC-QF. And remember, the U.S. already labeled the IRGC-QF as a terrorist organization, so this connection is significant. It's basically framing the Houthis as part of this larger network of actors that the administration sees as hostile to U.S. interests.
Okay, so we've got the context. Now let's talk about the impact of this designation. What does it actually mean? What changes on the ground?
Well, for one thing, it gives the U.S. a whole new set of tools to use against the Houthis. Things like economic sanctions, freezing assets, maybe even increased military support to that Saudi-led coalition that's fighting them in Yemen.
So this could escalate the conflict even further, couldn't it? I mean, Yemen's already facing a humanitarian crisis with people starving, displaced from their homes. It's a dire situation.
Yeah, that's a huge concern. And humanitarian groups have been speaking out about this since the designation was announced.
Mhm.
There's a real risk that more sanctions, more military action could make it even harder to get aid to the people who need it most.
It's a tough spot, isn't it? On one hand, they're trying to deal with what they see as a real security threat, but on the other hand, their actions could make a terrible humanitarian crisis even worse.
Yeah, it's a classic example of the difficult choices that policymakers have to grapple with. These complex situations, there are rarely easy answers, and any action is likely to have both good and bad outcomes.
It's a good reminder that foreign policy isn't black and white. It's about weighing those risks and benefits, trying to think ahead about unintended consequences, and realizing that your actions can have ripple effects way beyond what you initially intended.
Absolutely. And that brings us to a bigger question. What do all these presidential actions tell us about how this administration plans to operate?
Okay, so let's zoom out a bit. Look at the bigger picture. What are the main themes here? What kind of story are they telling us?
Well, one thing that really stands out is this focus on what they see as core American values. Things like individual liberty, free markets, limited government, a strong national defense. You can see that in their emphasis on merit-based systems, their skepticism of some diversity initiatives, and that really assertive stance they're taking on the world stage.
So it's kind of like a return to a more traditional, maybe even conservative way of thinking.
Yeah, you could say that. But it's also about being willing to shake things up, to really push their agenda. And they're not afraid to make bold moves, whether it's getting rid of old executive orders or taking a hard line against what they see as threats.
And that's where you come in, dear listener. How do you feel about this approach? Does it resonate with you? Do you share their sense of urgency? Or are you worried about what might happen? These are the questions we want you to keep thinking about as we see how this administration's story unfolds.
Remember, this is just a snapshot, a glimpse into what will likely be a pretty dynamic and unpredictable presidency.
And we hope this deep dive has given you the information and the tools to have those conversations, think critically about these issues, and come to your own conclusions about where we're headed as a country.
Keep asking those questions, keep challenging those assumptions, and most importantly, stay engaged. The future is being shaped right now, and your voice matters.
That's it for our deep dive into these presidential actions. Hope you enjoyed it. And remember, there's always more to learn, more to explore, more to discuss. Until next time, keep diving deep.